Good morning, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with a hurricane outlook and discussion recorded on June 14th, 2023, recorded on 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot of things to talk about today, including a rare tropical cyclone that might be forming in the main development region over the next several days. Will it really form, or is there going to be a bust? And a look at tropical cyclone activity picking up in the Eastern Pacific. Taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this morning, we notice that it is relatively quiet out there as we currently speak. We do have a few tropical waves right now that are approaching Trinidad and Tobago and the northern coast of South America. This is going to be another renewed threat for some potential flooding and mudslides across the area. Certainly in any of the higher elevation terrain down there, that could be a problem. Flooding is definitely going to be a concern as Trinidad and Tobago have been hit by some flooding in recent days from these tropical waves. Elsewise, though, across the Atlantic basin today, it is relatively quiet. We are going to be watching a massive severe weather threat shaping up across portions of the southeastern U.S., and we'll talk about that later in the video after the tropical discussion. But elsewise, a few tropical waves coming off the coast of Africa, and we will have to turn our attention to the main development region over the next several days. So starting off with a look at the tropical Atlantic, the tropical weather outlook for this morning as of 8 a.m. Nothing to monitor over the next 7 days, at least officially from the National Hurricane Center. However, I do believe that in the next few days we might start to see an area highlighted out here in the main development region as tropical cyclone genesis chances do pick up at least somewhat, and we'll talk about that more in greater detail here in a second. And then in the Eastern Pacific Basin, we are also going to be monitoring a potential for tropical cyclone formation out here with two areas for potential development, one with a 30% chance over the next 7 days as this system generally moves off towards the north and west here. And then another system that we're going to be monitoring behind that with a 20% chance of development over the next 7 days as this system also moves off towards the north and west. Both of these systems pose no threat to land at this current time, so that is certainly good news for portions of Mexico and also out here for the Baja Peninsula, but we will be continuing to monitor these two systems over the next several days. So taking a look here at the GFS 850 millibar vorticity, or the spin in the atmosphere at 5,000 feet off the ground, overlaid by the 25,000 feet or 300 millibar wind, which is in the arrows and text, and then overlaid on top of that is the mean sea level pressure. So what we're looking at right now, big ridge of high pressure out here. This is the subtropical ridge that is out here across near Bermuda. That's actually like Bermuda right there, or up here really. But this is basically the big old Bermuda high, for lack of better terms. And what we'll be monitoring is a tropical wave that is expected to emerge off the coast of Africa this weekend and into the early part of next week. So we go ahead and we run this forward. We notice that this is the incipient tropical wave that is expected to emerge off the coast of Africa over the next several days. And what ends up happening is this moves out into the main development region. You can kind of see, we'll go ahead and back this up a little bit. This moves out into the main development region where it kind of loses some of its steam, but then interacts with the monsoon trough, which is down here. This is the intertropical convergence zone. And so this area of spin in the atmosphere will get amplified by ongoing thunderstorm activity. And we notice that the ridge is centered pretty far to the north here, but the axis of the ridge digs pretty far to the south, meaning that most of this will be confined to the ITCZ, at least temporarily. The monsoon trough begins to break off, and you can see that some of its remnant vorticity or spin in the atmosphere tries to get evected northward. Now, comparatively to yesterday, we don't have a tropical cyclone forming here on the forecast model, but as I will show you here in a minute, the environment it's somewhat favorable for additional development, and so I do think there is a possibility that we might have a tropical cyclone forming in the main development region, even if it's a brief weak one. Generally, though, the steering pattern here remains relatively the same, with a big ridge of high pressure located to the north here in the kind of the subtropical high Atlantic here, and the axis of this ridge digging pretty far south, so this should be on a course towards the Lesser Antilles if this were to, or really the Greater Antilles, especially across the northern area here, the Leeward Islands. If this were to verify, you would have some tropical moisture that would surge off into the Antilles as we progress throughout the week of next week, that is. So again, we're looking and targeting for late next week that we might see tropical moisture arriving in the Antilles. Again, tropical cyclone or not, it's very hard to say, but let's go ahead and look at some of the other environmental factors that are playing into this. So what we're looking at here is a GFS representation of a skew-T diagram for a developing tropical cyclone in the Eastern Pacific Basin. We're not going to jump into too much of the science behind this, but why am I showing the Eastern Pacific? Well, this is going to matter when we're talking about the Atlantic Basin in just a second, and this kind of gives a decent illustration of what we should be looking for. Now, if we notice here, indicated by a skew-T diagram, the green line here is the temperature, or the dew point temperature, and the solid red line here is the actual temperature indicated by the forecast model. Now, one of the things that we do notice is that the temperature dew point lines stay relatively close together throughout the entire atmospheric column here into the stratosphere. And what this indicates is that we have a fairly moist atmospheric profile. And we need this for tropical cyclones because, again, if you have a lot of dry air in the upper levels, we'll talk about this here in a second, that is not going to be good. And we'll get into why here in a minute. But we do notice that the temperature dew point lines are relatively close together, and even as you go up in the atmosphere, where you have less of a mixing ratio, which is basically just how much the atmosphere can hold, it's colder up here, but in a specific humidity sense, it is very moist all the way throughout the entire depth of the atmosphere and into the upper troposphere and stratosphere. So it's very moist, which means that down here at the surface, we can get thunderstorms to easily develop as a result of tropical cyclone processes, basically a wishy process called wind-induced surface fluxes here that can actually induce thunderstorm development. And we're not going to get too much into the dynamics behind that. But if we switch it to the GFS sounding here, a box sounding in the Atlantic Basin, this is for forecast hour 144, valid on 2 a.m. on the 20th of June. We notice out here in the Atlantic Basin, it's not going to be the sounding that we saw out here. First of all, the temperature dew point lines are actually further towards the left, which means it is, in a specific humidity sense, it is actually more stable and there's less relative humidity. So while this would be a good sounding that you would, see for thunderstorm development over land, the same cannot be said for over water. So what we notice here is that it is relatively dry in the mid-levels in a specific relative humidity sense. It is actually relatively dry. And so these thunderstorms, as they try to develop out here, they're going to start to mix down a lot of this dry, stable air from aloft and bring it down to the surface. And it is going to actually, lead to a reduction in the overall temperature, because this is going to bring that dry air, mix it down, or dry, stable, cool air down to the surface, and through downdrafts and the downdraft fluxes, it is actually going to reduce the surface temperature down. Now, this is what you would typically see in developing cyclones, but the problem is that because there is dry air, the PWatts here are only 2.10 inches, so it's less of a moist environment, and there is some shear here. We notice that there is some shear, we get it into the trades here of about 15 knots or so, and then aloft we have southerly winds compared to our easterly winds. So this might actually bring in more dry air from the surrounding environment and try to wrap it around, and so the process of actually warming and moistening the boundary layer here, which is actually just the surface of the atmosphere, basically, is probably not going to be completed. Irregardless, though, it would not surprise me to see a cyclone try to form. However, if we look at the ECMWF sounding here, this is just the operational forecast, keep in mind. But again, it's showing an even drier, more stable air aloft here, which would not be good for tropical cyclone formation if this were to indeed verify. Now, one of the things that we need to look at here is the ensembles. This is the European 0Z run from 8 p.m. last evening, and we notice that the ensemble forecast does start to pick up on some tropical cyclone formation markers out here. All of these red numbers indicates an area of relatively lower pressure, and we do start to know and indicate that there is the potential for something of a low pressure system to be out here within the next about 5 to 6 days. This is hour 132 on the 19th of June, and we continue to run this forward, and there is definitely at least somewhat of an indication of some type of cyclone out here that is trying to form or area of lower pressure. So while the formation chances have not been marked from the Hurricane Center, it would not surprise me in the very least to see this actually get some type of marking, maybe 10 or 20%. The overall conditions out here do appear at least somewhat favorable, but as this system heads towards the Antilles, that's seemingly where this is going to go. The models are in pretty good agreement of that. As this gets closer to the Antilles, the environment becomes more unfavorable, as we would expect for this time of the year. And finally, taking a look out here in the Eastern Pacific Basin, we're looking at the 850 millibar vorticity. So again, just a spin in the atmosphere at 5,000 feet off the ground. And we'll just take a real quick look at what's going on. There is some tropical cyclones that could be forming. We noticed that in the forecast guidance, there is at least 2 cyclones that form in the Eastern Pacific Basin. I don't really see these being much of a threat, honestly, over the next 7 to 10 days to any sort of landmass. I just don't think we're going to be having the steering pattern to carry these systems anywhere close to where they could impact land. So the good news is that I think these will remain out across the open waters and not really bother anybody, except for generating some swells that will radiate outward towards the coastlines here. So certainly rip currents could be a little bit of a problem for any beachgoers along the entire Mexican coastline and the Baja Peninsula. But elsewise, I am not really seeing anything that would indicate any significant threat. In the severe weather department, there is a relatively rare moderate risk for severe storms, a level 4 out of 5 risk, which is very rare for this time of the year in this given area across the southeastern part of the United States. Now, I would assume this would be something we would see in March or April, or in the winter months, as we get these big, troughs to form out here and dig down and create all the necessary ingredients for severe storms out across the southern part in the southeast U.S. But there is a moderate risk for severe storms generally today from about Jackson, Mississippi, all the way through Montgomery, Alabama, all the way through Albany, and to near Macon, Georgia, with a level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk from near Waycross, Savannah, to near Tallahassee, Mobile, all the way back through Shreveport and Texarkana, with a slight risk from about Fort Smith, Dallas, Little Rock, Arkansas, to near Jacksonville, Florida, and a marginal risk to just about Marion County in Ocala, Florida, along the Interstate 75 and Interstate 95 areas, respectively. The tornado probability for today is a 10% significant risk across portions of Alabama and Georgia. Very rare for this time of year. So we could see some strong, potentially significant tornadoes today out across this region. 2% risk all the way to near Marion County, Florida, in the northern central Florida peninsula. We also have an attendant damaging hail threat as well. 30% threat for some significant hail out here across the enhanced risk area from eastern Texas all the way through portions of southwestern Georgia. And also a potential for some very significant winds. 45% area indicated by the 45% area here where my cursor is. This indicates a 45% chance or greater, or 45% chance of seeing wind gusts reaching over 60 miles per hour within 25 miles of a given point. So a very substantial risk out here today, by far. Very significant severe weather threat. So do be aware, have multiple ways to receive weather warnings, and we'll be talking about this as needed over the next several hours. All right. So that being said, be safe, everyone. Take care. God bless. And I'll talk to you guys again some more over the next several days.